Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Um, okay, that's bad. I'm sorry, just adjusting my screen. Shana Tova to all those who celebrated, and it's just been a glorious fall so far, and counting down to the election. So I'm looking forward to doing this wonderful Dickens book with you. Before we get into that, I just want to let you know that Nancy, Sheila, Beth Lambert, and I have added a class for this semester, for the last 4 weeks of the semester. And it's a discussion class. So numbers are very limited. There was a cancellation at OLLI, and we were offered the opportunity to do something. So it's going to be 4 sessions. Each session's got a brief theme. You'll have a brief presentation from one or more of us, very brief. And then we're hoping to turn it into a discussion group. As I say, numbers are very limited. So if you want to go sign up for that, there's still plenty of room, but we want it to be not just us talking to people, but having a connected discussion as best we can. If that format is successful, we will try and repeat it in the winter semester and spring. So just to let you know about that. And I did get one question already on the Q&A about whether I've ever considered doing a class on the Brontes. I have done the Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre before, but members come in and go out, so maybe you weren't here for that, Dave. I know in winter I'm going to do Madame Bovary. I'm still thinking about spring, so it kind of really depends what people have got in mind, but I think a lot of people may have taken that class, so I don't want to repeat that, but maybe open to doing something by Anne Bronte, Turn to Wildfell Hall, or another of the Charlotte Bronte books, so thank you for that idea. Okay. The new discussion group class, I've got a couple of questions about that. It is going to be on Tuesdays, and it's going to be 11:50, I believe, in that Tuesday 11:50 slot, the last 4 weeks of the semester. So it begins on, let me see, October 20th, and it's called Book Talk. I don't have the number, but and I can't look it up at the moment, but maybe Meg can and come in with the answer for that, for the number of the class. Okay. So Charles Dickens and Please Sir, Can I Have Some More? I think I read this a very, very, very long time ago. I know I was probably inspired by the movie Oliver, the British movie. Oh, I should remind you before we start, I hope everybody got this reading schedule that I sent out to everybody who'd signed up. If you signed up after I sent it out and you want to have a copy, just email me and I'll mail that to you. We've only got 6 sessions for this. We squeezed this class in once we knew we were going to be online again, because the planning, as I say, we're already planning for spring, and the planning process is so far ahead that we had sort of decided the autumn sessions before the COVID thing hit, and we were sort of scrambling to squeeze stuff in. So we've only got 6 sessions. We've got 3 weeks and then a break and then another 3 weeks. And the final week, this Wednesday will be Veterans Day. So there's no final class. So 3 weeks, a break of a week, and then 3 weeks. And as I say, I sent out the reading schedule. Read ahead all you want, but we're going to keep the class discussion limited to these chapters. So for today I had chapters 1 to 5, just the very beginning of the book, because I wanted to give you a little background. As I say, I think I read it in response, and it was a long time ago, in response to the movie Oliver, the great musical. And if you're not all singing, you've got to pick a pocket or two, or something like that before the end of this, then I have not done my job properly. The film version came out in 1968. I was too young to go see it, excuse me, when it came out. But there was a movie theatre in Sheffield that they used to show sort of old movies, you know, movies that had gone past their first run on weekdays. And I remember my mum taking me to see some of her favorites. She was a big fan of the musicals. I saw South Pacific that way. I mean, long after it first came out, but we would just go, and it was, you know, very cheap to get seats. And I think I saw Oliver that way too. It did win the Best Picture Oscar in 1968, along with 5 other Oscars. And so it was, you know, a bit of a triumph for the British film industry at that time. And when I read the book again now, I can't picture anybody else but the actors from that movie in these parts, you know, particularly the great Ron Moody as Fagin, and little Mark Lester as Oliver, the little blonde angelic boy. Anyway, the book is a lot more than the movie, and it's a lot more in depth, and there's a lot more richness to it, as great as the movie is. But I will give you the most random fact that you're probably ever going to get in an OLLI class, is that one of the dancers in the movie came from the little tiny village where I grew up. And I can see him, he's on screen for about 2 seconds when the Artful Dodger is singing Consider Yourself at Home. And I can see him. I think his first name was Michael, I can't remember his last name, but anyway, he was obviously much older than me because he was a dancer when I was only 4, but random fact, 6 degrees of separation from the actors in Oliver Twist. Anyway, yeah, I was just thinking about that because I went back to look at that scene, and I'm thinking quite how sanitized London is. And I mean, you know, none of the sort of real dirt or smells or what have you of the city. So it is a fantastic movie, but it's not really real. There's a lot of complexity to the book, and I don't think I realized that when I first read it either. I was, I don't know if you can see the illustration on my copy. This gentleman here is Fagin, the Jew. And, you know, he's got this dark, swarthy complexion and this big hook nose. Whether or not Dickens was actually anti-Semitic, or whether he was parodying anti-Semitism, is something that we'll discuss later in the book when we get to those chapters. Just a little background. The book Oliver Twist was written between 1837 and 1839. I'm sorry, serialized between 1837 and 1839. Dickens was only about 23 or 24 when he started writing this. So I've got a 25-year-old would-be novelist upstairs right now. I have to kick him into gear to get his opus published. But Dickens was a young man, as I say. It was released monthly, and it was actually released as a 3-volume book before the serial ended. So it was one of those things, if you had the money, you could go out and either buy or borrow from the lending library the 3-volume book and find out how the story ended before magazine readers could do that. So thank goodness there was no social media, because people would have been posting spoilers everywhere. It was Dickens' second novel. It was very well received. It was really the first major Victorian novel. Remember, Victoria only came to the throne in 36, so it's very early on in that period. But it was their first novel of that period to have a child protagonist. And there are a lot of elements about young Oliver Twist's life based on Dickens' own early life. Those of you who took my class on David Copperfield will know that you know, Charles Dickens had a fairly tough childhood. His father was impecunious at best. You know, the character of Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield is very heavily based on Dickens' own father, you know, always perilously skating close to the line of having no money and being thrown in the debtor's prison. And Dickens himself had to go out to work in a blacking factory when he was a very young boy. So he certainly understood what it was like to grow up and be treated as an adult before you're ready for it, to have to go to work, to have to, you know, suffer in that sort of way. So there are a lot of elements of Oliver Twist also based on his own life. A couple of characters that we'll get to later are also based on people he knew, but the character of Oliver Twist is, a lot of it is reflective of his childhood, although Dickens was not an orphan. But he did know apparently a child named Peter Tolliver, who was an orphan and who had, I think, gone to work with him in the blacking factory. So maybe that's where he got the name from. The names are kind of fascinating. I always like to think about names and why he's chosen them. And Dickens really is the sort of master of names. Oliver, the name actually is a combination of two Old Norse words, which mean elf and warrior. So I sort of like that, because I don't know if Dickens even possibly knew that. I mean, maybe he just picked up the name from Peter Tolliver because he liked it. But it is fascinating to think that, you know, it had that connotation, because our little Oliver is a little elf, and he is a warrior. He's a fighter for himself. The popularity of the name had drastically fallen off before this novel. The name Oliver, that is, because of Oliver Cromwell. And this novel revived the popularity of the name, and it still remains one of the most popular names for boys in the UK to this date. Okay, I'm going to pause there. I see we have a couple of Q&As. Martha says, yes, Oliver actually says, please, sir, I want some more, not can I have some more. I think I got the title from the movie, which is, but I'd have to check that too. I didn't quite fact check it. So yes, you are correct. It doesn't say, can I have some more? But you knew what I meant. And Janice asks, what is a blacking factory? A blacking factory was where they made the blacking that, if you think about the old stoves and cast iron stoves and fireplaces in Victorian England, they're black and they have to be polished. And the blacking was the black polish. And it was, by all accounts, a very dirty, horrible, nasty place for little boys and girls to work. So I don't know if we have any more hands up or any more questions.
Not currently.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so the big sort of impetus behind this book was an act that passed in 1834, the Poor Law Amendment Act, PLAA, and it was just known really as the Poor Law. It's really hard to overstate how huge this was in terms of people's lives. Possibly quite like the passing of the Civil Rights Act in this country in the 60s. It was a massive change. It followed on from the Reform Act in 1832, which had given a lot of middle-class people, middle-class men, I should say, the vote. And so it had enfranchised a lot of middle-class people. There were property requirements for voting. So it had to be, you couldn't still vote if you were poor. And prior to this, people who were in need of assistance because they had no money had sort of fallen into sort of a very piecemeal system, usually run by the church, and sort of meted out by local parishes. A parish is just the area that's served by one church, so often one village was a whole parish. In the sort of beginnings of the industrial cities, particularly like, oh, sorry, what's the name of the screen? Particularly something like Manchester or Sheffield or Leeds or Birmingham or Liverpool, all those big industrial cities that were just, coming into being, there'd be multiple parishes within the bounds of one city, but a parish was just, as I say, served by a church, one church. And it was usually the parish's responsibility to distribute food and money and clothing and all that kind of stuff to the needy, to the poor. And it was just done on a sort of fairly random basis, and depended, very much on the luck of the draw where you lived. The poor were given these things and able to live in their own homes, and it was called outdoor relief. It didn't mean that they had to live outdoors. It just meant that if you were giving money to somebody and allowing him or her to stay in their own home or their own room, then that was called outdoor relief. There were some workhouses that housed people who had nowhere to live. And again, there was no sort of system or rhyme or reason to the way that aid was given to the poor. So the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 tried to remedy that. And they divided the whole of the country into 24 different districts and gave the districts the power to regulate the poor, the charity to the poor and what was given to them. It was paid for by this big new group of voters, the middle class men who'd been enfranchised a couple of years before. And you will see it referred to as being funded by rate payers. Rates were the property tax. So you had to have enough money to own property to qualify to vote. And then you had to pay a tax based on the size of your property. And this was what was used to fund the new poor law. The powers that be decided that in the Victorian wisdom that, the poor were really just lazy people who just didn't want to work and couldn't be bothered. There were two Victorian sort of philosophers at the time, Bentham and Malthus. Malthus basically said, if you keep giving the poor money, they'll just have more poor babies and we'll just run out of resources at some point. So let's not encourage that. And Bentham was of the view that if you gave people the opportunity, they would choose sort of basically the line of least resistance and would not do anything and were not interested in working if they could get something for free. And that we were just going to perpetuate this poverty problem by throwing money at these people who had no interest in doing anything else. Obviously, those views are really completely anathema to us now, but they huge traction at the time. So the powers that be in their wisdom decided that what they would do was really ban all outdoor relief, that is giving clothes, food, money to people to enable them to remain in their own homes and hopefully go to work. And that if you were in need of assistance, you would have to go to a workhouse. And they absolutely were straight up honest about it. They decided the workhouses had to be so miserable and so uncomfortable and so meager that people would only go there if they had absolutely no other alternative. They actually described wanting these workhouses to be prison-like and, with a bare minimum of subsistence. So they set out to make them as horrible as possible. And of course, the Victorian workhouse has become a byword for, inhumanity and cruelty in that era. People who were paying for it, as I say, were the ratepayers, and they were, this kind of, their mentality was, well, I have property and I work hard and I'm being taxed for it. So I don't see why I should give any of my money to these indigents who don't want to do anything. And so there was no incentive to improve conditions and help people even get back on their feet. Once you got into a workhouse, you were given a uniform to wear, very often with, the horrible sort of rough cloth and what have you. Men and women were separated, as were children. So even within the same workhouse, there were divisions so that, you go in as a family and you may not see your spouse or your child on a day-to-day basis. And you were given fairly useless work to do, just because they didn't want you to be idle, but it wasn't intended to really produce anything. So they were particularly horrible. They got hold much more in the south of England than they did in the north of England, because even apart from the cities in the north, a lot of the north was still quite rural, and it was only a very unemployment in the rural parts of the country was very seasonal. I.e., you might go to the workhouse for December and January when there was nothing growing and there was no work to be had in the fields. But as soon as the weather began to warm up, even just a fraction, there was jobs to be done on the farms, and so on and so forth. So it was very seasonal in the rural areas, but obviously in the more urban areas, in this developing industrial revolution, the workhouses were often filled year round. So Dickens saw the results of this. He was, as you know, a big social reformer, and he was appalled at some of the outcomes of this poor law. One of the authors of the poor law himself was actually made very unhappy by the terms that were eventually put into the Act and the way that they were implemented. And so there were articles written in newspapers, saying, look, this is what's happening to people and it's terrible, and we shouldn't be treating people like this. They did have voices of dissent even then, saying that this was out of line. But of course, as I said, the people who were in the workhouses couldn't vote, so and they had no money. And it may be you would only go to the workhouse if it was a matter of life or death. The conditions often horrifically inhumane, as I said, and the worst part about it, and this speaks directly to, I think, the beginning chapters of Oliver Twist, is that illegitimate children, the mothers of illegitimate children, were treated the worst of all. Before the Poor Law Amendment Act came into being, if a woman got pregnant, the authorities would track down the father and make him pay something for the upkeep of the child, and very often make him marry the mother, assuming he wasn't married already. The Victorians decided that this was just increasing wanton women who would just get pregnant to trap men into matrimony, or just women who were unchaste. The promoting bastardy and want of chastity was the language I think they used in that act. So they stopped tracking down the fathers of these illegitimate children and made the mothers solely responsible. And that just increased the misery. And I think there's some suggestion that that's what happened to Oliver's mother at the beginning of this book. Fascinatingly, there was a 2019 study about the Poor Law Amendment Act and what impact it had on society. And on the one hand, as I said, it had a massive impact on people's lives, on the way they were treated, on their future. I mean, we have no real way of knowing how many people died because they were in these horrible, inhumane conditions, and they were basically starving to death or starved to death, and just, really treated like worse than animals. So we have no way of knowing those numbers and the massive effect it had on people's lives. But the 2019 study said, in actual fact, there was no impact on wages. It didn't either boost or reduce wages. It had no impact on people's mobility. They were not able to go and move across country to look for work because they were poor. And so it didn't change that. It didn't change people's ability to look for work. And it didn't change the fertility rates. People got pregnant in the same numbers as they had done before the Poor Law Amendment Act was implemented. So a tremendous amount of suffering for no practical gain was the result. But Dickens saw all this. He he was an avid social reformer, and particularly at that age, when you're 24 or 25, he had all the zeal of somebody who thought he could make a difference. And his book, Oliver Twist, was really a direct result of what he'd seen with the poor law and what he wanted to achieve. And he thought, that writing letters to the Times was all very well and good, but if he could depict it in a book, then people would perceive it on a much more human level. And I think that's very true. So I will pause there and see if we have any questions, comments, thoughts.
I have no currently open questions.
Okay. So let's look at Oliver Twist. I have the original illustrations in my book. I don't know who else has them, but if I get to one, I will hold it up so you can see it. So we find out from the beginning that it was touch and go as to whether Oliver would actually spend any time in this world or not. We begin with his birth, and we see Dickens humor at this right from the very beginning, because this is the third paragraph. The fact is that there was considerable difficulty in inducing Oliver to take upon himself the office of respiration, a troublesome practice, but one which custom has rendered necessary to our easy existence. And, he talks about Oliver sort of like probably a lot of children in these workhouses, without good medical attention may have just given up and died because they didn't have anybody to help them into this world. Although, of course, Dickens inverts that fact. He says, if during this brief period, Oliver had been surrounded by careful grandmothers, anxious aunts, experienced nurses and doctors of profound wisdom, he would most inevitably and indubitably have been killed in no time. Obviously he's being ironic there and saying that, there must be all the help in the world would have been given to the children of middle class or wealthy women, but poor Oliver was left to fend for himself on this flock mattress, which is a mattress just made out of stuff with old cloth, basically. Oliver and nature fought out the point between them, and the result was that after a few struggles, Oliver breathed, sneezed, and proceeded to advertise to the inmates of the workhouse the fact of a new burden having been imposed upon the parish, by setting up as loud a cry as could reasonably have been expected from a male infant who had not been possessed of that very useful appendage, a voice, for a much longer space of time than 3 minutes and a quarter. Again, how, sad. You think of a child coming into this world as a great joy and a great delight and a reason for celebration, and Oliver's entry into the world is noted only that he's become one more burden to the parish. We have this, lovely sort of little picture of the surgeon who has, obviously got some humanity to him and tried his best. And the woman who's the pauper woman who's drinking whatever she can all the time. And they've sort of done their best, but poor Oliver's mother says, that's it. I gave birth to him. I want to die. And she does. They say, no, you're not going to die. But she's just given up. The struggle for life, this birthing this child has been the last measure of energy and that she can possibly expend. And so here we have poor little Oliver alone in the world, and in this horrible place the workhouse, and nobody knows where this woman came from. They notice, the old woman says she was lying in the street. She'd walked some distance, for her shoes were worn to pieces, but where she came from or where she was going to, nobody knows. And you know, we're left with the end of this chapter, this little tableau of, as I say, poor Oliver, this child crying lustily, and this sort of drunken old woman being the only one in charge of him, and he's got nothing but sort of worn second-down, hand-me-down robes, a parish child, the orphan of a workhouse, the humble half-starved drudge, to be cuffed and buffeted through the world, despised by all and pitied by none. So, okay, so I can see one Q&A. Yes, Corky asks, how do children fare in orphanages at a point where they put in the workhouse? Yes, very early. And we see it in this book too. I think he gets to 9 years old and they decide that, you know, enough of this lounging around at 9 years old. It's time to go to work and be put off. We had this expression in Great Expectations, of a child being brought up by hand. If you remember from the beginning of Great Expectations, Pip was brought up by hand. And there's kind of a dual meaning in Great Expectations, because we know Mrs. Joe was very free with giving Pip a slap around the upside of the head every now and again. But it really means, being brought up by hand really means not being nursed by a wet nurse or being nursed by your mother, but being fed sort of, you know, milk, cow's milk, basically. You know, as soon as you're old enough, you know, bits of gruel probably. So Oliver, we know, because obviously his mother has died, you either need a wet nurse or you need some external source of food. Being brought up by hand actually didn't mean Mrs. Joe slapping him around. It meant, you know, giving him milk, which was considered to be more expensive, and it was another burden on the parish that somebody would have to pay for that milk. So I don't know, there are all kinds of studies nowadays about, you know, immune systems being boosted by breast milk. So presumably those who got brought up by hand in a more expensive fashion often fared worse for it. And Corky also asked, did Dickens advocate for social changes beyond his novels? Yes, he did. And when he went on his lecture tours, he talked about it, and he did write letters as well. And he did speak out about these injustices, but he was by far most popular as a depictor of the problems in society in his books. And so therefore that's what got him the most attention. So I don't know if we have anybody hands raised who wants to.
There are no hands currently.
Okay. So we move on to chapter 2. He was, as I say, oh, this is where he is brought up by hand. It does say so. So the parish did ask him, the parish authorities inquired with dignity of the workhouse authorities whether there was no female then domiciled in the house, that's the workhouse, who was in a situation to impart to Oliver Twist the consolation and nourishment of which he stood in need. I.e., is there another nursing mother in there who can give him breast milk and feed him that way? Now, it's worded as the consolation and nourishment. And again, Dickens is being very ironic here, because the parish authorities don't give two figs about his consolation and nourishment. The parish authorities want to save money on this very expensive cow's milk and bread and gruel and whatever they're giving him. So, you know, there's a hint of irony to all kinds of statements in this book. You should be aware as we go along. Just look for those, because very often, sometimes it's more overt, but very often, you know, Dickens is having a sly jab saying, that you don't care about his welfare. You just wanted somebody to, do this for you so you didn't have to pay. And obviously, in the workhouses, very often there would be other nursing mothers, because if you were, poor to the point of desperation and you were pregnant, you would go to a workhouse, because at least you were guaranteed a roof over your head and some form of food, even if it was the very bare minimum. So very often there were nursing mothers, but in this occasion there were not. So the parish authorities magnanimously and humanely resolved, again, more irony, they're not even remotely humane, that Oliver should be farmed, or in other words, that he should be dispatched to a branch workhouse some 3 miles off, where 20 or 30 other juvenile offenders against the poor laws rolled about the floor all day without the inconvenience of too much food or too much clothing, under the parental superintendence of an elderly female who received the culprits at and for the consideration of 7 halfpence per small head per week. 7pence halfpenny's worth per week is a good round diet for a child. A great deal may be got for 7pence halfpenny, quite enough to overload its stomach and make it uncomfortable. The elderly female was a woman of wisdom and experience. She knew what was good for children, and so she had a very accurate perception of what was good for herself. So she appropriated the greater part of the weekly stipend to her own use, and consigned the rising parochial generation to an even shorter allowance than was originally provided for them. So again, more sarcasm, irony from Dickens. They talk about the inconvenience of too much food or too much clothing. This just like babies being left in a room by themselves. God knows how many of them, pull coals out of the fire on top of themselves or what have you. And the woman is, the elderly female is described as wisdom and experience, 2 qualities which you think would be tremendous qualities to have in somebody, but her wisdom is and experience is completely and totally self-serving, and she's literally taking the food out of these children's mouths. But they must have perceived somehow in the parish that it was cheaper to pay 7pence halfpenny a week per child than it was to maintain them in the workhouse. So this woman gets the care of these parish children. This will call parish children because although the poor law had arranged things into a district, it was still, for convenience sake at this point, monitored on a sort of very micro local level of a parish. Mary Lou says, I love this comment. The discussion of unwed mothers brings to mind a song titled Unwed Fathers by the folk singer John Prine, who died this year of COVID. He said, everyone talks pejoratively about the mothers and not the negligence of the fathers. Yeah, thank you for that, Mary Lou. I had forgotten that song. I love John Prine and seen him many, many times. And yeah, his death from COVID was one of the early shocks of this pandemic. So if you haven't heard the song, go download John Prine, and not just that song, but basically his entire repertoire, because he's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, look, at this point, society is run by men. Not that things have changed tremendously in 200 years, but society is completely run by men, and it's their prerogative to blame the mothers, and that's what they do. And poor Oliver is just the latest recipient of that, and he's managed to take a breath and managed to survive in this world. But it's almost like he's surviving against the odds, and that's why I like the Old Norse name of the elf warrior, because he's a tiny little underfed, undernourished boy. And I still can't help but see Mark Lester from the film version when I picture him, this sort of angelic little figure who's way too small for his age. So, but he is a fighter, he's a warrior. And on that note, I just want to make another note about names and Dickens being sort of the king of names. The elderly woman who is looking after Oliver is called Mrs. Mann. I mean, it's spelt with two N's, but it's kind of like, could she be any less maternal? Only if she were a man, right? And we find the beadle, Mr. Bumble. The beadle was just the parish. She was fairly low-ranking officer in a parish. He was not very senior, but he was charged with enforcing any parish orders, be it poor law or law and order, or often laws against public drunkenness and things like that. The beadle would be around to sort of break up the drunken party and send everybody home. And he, in this novel, is Mr. Bumble, and he is a bumbler. He bumbles both his job and he mangles the English language. So Mrs. Mann and Mr. Bumble are very, very well named for their qualities, I think. We find out Mr. Bumble is a fat man. When Oliver goes back in front of the board, we have another comment that they're all fat. And so, the idea that these people would know what it's like to be hungry and to have some kind of empathy is ridiculous, because they're all, we know Mrs. Mann is literally taking the food away from children and keeping it for herself. And obviously, all these people in charge of the parish have no empathy for these paupers in the workhouse, because they've never been short of a meal in their lives, as far as we can tell. So we get to Oliver being 9. There is a note saying, these children very often just did die in much bigger numbers than children who were born into middle class and working class, middle and good working class families. Disease was no respecter of income, but just having somebody there to watch over a baby and be careful of it. And so babies died of accidents. Dickens says this. I'm on the second big paragraph in this chapter. It did say, for at the very moment when a child had contrived to exist upon the smallest possible portion of the weakest possible food, it did perversely happen in 8.5 cases out of 10. And I think he's making that up. I don't know that he had that real statistic, but it's meant to shock you into realizing just how many kids just died in these kinds of situations. Either got sickened from want and cold, or fell into the fire from neglect, or got half smothered by accident. In any one of which cases, the miserable little being was usually summoned into another world, and there gathered to the fathers which it had never known in this. One of the big causes of death in the more rural areas was drowning, because kids would fall into ponds and wells and lakes and all kinds of things and just not know how to swim. But as I say, if you leave babies crawling around where there's an open fire, or just babies turning over in the night and getting smothered by blankets, it's actually quite a wonder that anybody would survive in situations like this. But Oliver does. Oliver Twist survives. And on his 9th birthday, we find him a pale, thin child, somewhat diminutive in stature and decidedly small in circumference. Well, of course, he's not getting anywhere near he needs to eat. So this is when Mr. Bumble comes to take him back to the workhouse. It's decided he's been living in the lap of luxury at Mrs. Mann's for far too long. And we get this little side comedy played out, because Mrs. Mann, who's kind of locked them in the cellar, the coal cellar, I think, she doesn't want to be found out that she's locked Oliver and a couple of his contemporaries in the coal cellar. So she's, behind her back, she's sort of making motions to one of the other girls, Susan, who's called, to get him out and go wash the worst of the coal from Oliver's face, so Mr. Bumble doesn't realize where he's been. Not that we think Mr. Bumble's going to really much care. And then we have this little comedy of Mrs. Mann offering Mr. Bumble a drink of gin, and Mr. Bumble at first saying, no, I'm on duty, I can't do that. And Mrs. Mann's just saying, oh, have a drink. So, we can see how it is. Mr. Beadle's just wandering around, sort of ordering little boys to go to the workhouse and drinking his gin and water. So Mrs. Mann does say, when she's going through this sort of pantomime with Mr. Bumble, you put it's Daffy, and Daffy was actually a medication made for children, and the principal ingredient was gin, so Daffy became a slang word for gin. I think, again, we can see that, Mrs. Mann is not dispensing very well. This may be one instance where it's to the benefit of the children that Mrs. Mann does not dispense the medicine to the children, but keeps it for herself, because I don't know that gin is particularly helpful for most childhood ailments. So we find out, why Oliver gets his last name. Mr. Bumble has decided to name him, and he's going in alphabetical order. It made me think this week, not that this is a laughing matter because it's very, very serious, but they've run out of names for the tropical storms. So we're now at Storm Beta, and it's the next one will be Gamma, I think. And I don't know what they're going to do if they run out of letters in the Greek alphabet. But Mr. Bumble has no such qualms, because he just goes through the alphabet. He says, we name our fondlings, he means foundling, in alphabetical order. The last was an S, Swabble, I named him. This was a T, Twist, I named him. The next one as comes will be Unwin, and the next Vilkins. I've got names ready-made to the end of the alphabet and all the way through it again when we come to Z. And Mrs. Mann responds with, you're quite a literary character, sir. And the Beadle sort of puffed up with his own self-importance about this, So, again, we get this lovely pantomime of Oliver being told that he has to leave. And Mrs. Mann is standing behind Mr. Bumble, and she's shaking her fist at Oliver to sort of direct him in this play act that he should pretend to be heartbroken that he has to leave. And Oliver sort of, gets it. But as Dickens points out, as wretched as it was, this is the only home he's ever known. And the other little orphans he's sharing this with are the only companions he's ever had in his life. So we can suppose he was actually somewhat regretful, truly, about leaving. Mr. Bumble tells Oliver, you're going to go before the board. And of course, that means nothing to Oliver. He's like, he doesn't know what a board is. I mean, it's, why would he know? But he makes him bow to the board, and then we see that they start asking him questions, and again the irony here, the comedy behind it. Even though we feel tremendously for this poor little boy who's suddenly sort of shoved in front of all these fat old men and told to sort of perform, basically, but. So with basically, the people asking him questions and the Beadle tapping him with his cane, made Oliver answer in a very low and hesitating voice, whereupon a gentleman in a white waistcoat said he was a fool, which was a capital way of raising his spirits and putting him quite at his ease. So, they tell him he's an orphan. He said, "What's that?" And the white waistcoat says, "He is a fool." I mean, it's poor boy. So they tell him that he has to join the workhouse now, and he's going to get fed, but he has to be taught a useful trade, they say. So you'll begin to pick oakum tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. Oakum was just loose fibers made by unwinding old ropes. And what those fibers were, what use they were put to, I have no idea. It seems to be sort of make work that has no real value and is certainly not a useful trade. But they send him off, and poor Oliver goes and finds his board bed, which is, this rough, hard bed. He sobbed himself to sleep. Dickens talks about these members of the board, they're sort of patting themselves on the back for being real Christians and for doing well. He says the members of this board were very sage, deep, philosophical men. And when they came to turn their attention to the workhouse, they found out at once what ordinary folks would never have discovered. The poor people liked it. It was a regular place of public entertainment for the poorer classes. A tavern where there was nothing to pay. A public breakfast, dinner, tea, and supper all the year round. A brick and mortar Elysium. Elysium from the Greek mythology of heaven, basically, where you go after death. And so, they decide that this is way too comfortable. This is obviously how workhouses were in their existence prior to the poor law. And so they established the rule that all poor people should have the alternative of being starved by a gradual process in the house or a quick one out of it. And they're making this gruel, which is just cereal, and they just keep adding more and more water to make things as miserable as possible. So, we have this situation, and this is when we come to the crucial comments, which I have misquoted in the title of this class, but never mind. They have a bowl. Each child has a bowl, and again, I can see the scene in the movie for this. These long wooden tables full of people eating these tiny amounts of rations. Each boy had one porringer. That's just the bowl, and they get their portion of gruel every day, apart from festive occasions. When he had 2 ounces and a quarter of bread, they mean a quarter of a slice of bread, not a whole loaf. Anyway, all the boys have been this way. They've been so hungry for so long that they really just, are getting desperate. And they put Oliver up with, lots of casts. It's like Oliver draws the short straw and he has to go ask. The evening arrived, the boys took their places. The master in his cook's uniform stationed himself at the copper. The copper is the big pot where they make the whole, all the gruel for everybody and then dole it out of the copper. His pauper assistants ranged themselves behind him. The gruel was served out and a long grace was set over the short commons. Commons is food. This is just a lovely play on words that, they're getting sort of short servings of food, but they have to say a long grace. This idea again that this is truly a Christian institution, which is sort of laughable in the way they're treating people. But again, a nice little Dickensian play on words of a long grace and short commons. The gruel disappeared. The boys whispered each other and winked at Oliver, while his next neighbors nudged him. Child as he was desperate with hunger and reckless with misery. He rose from the table and advancing to the master, basin and spoon in hand, said, somewhat alarmed at his own temerity, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, another fat, healthy man in this workhouse full of poor, starving people. But he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment on the small rebel for some seconds, and then clung for support to the copper. The assistants were paralyzed with wonder. The boys were paralyzed with fear. "What?" said the master at length in a faint voice. "Please, sir," said Oliver, "I want some more." The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with the ladle, pinioned him in his arms, and shrieked aloud for the beadle. The board were sitting in solemn conclave when Mr. Bumble rushed into the room in great excitement, and addressing the gentleman in the high chair, said, "Mr. Limbkins, I beg your pardon, sir. Oliver Twist has asked for more." There was a general start. Horror was depicted on every countenance. "For more?" said Mr. Limbkins. "Compose yourself, Bumble, and answer me distinctly. Do I understand that he asked for more after he'd eaten the supper allotted by the dietary?" "He did, sir," replied Bumble. "That boy will be hung," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat. "I know that boy will be hung." And here's the picture I have in my edition of Oliver asking for more. The master in the apron, the paupers ranged and the boys behind him. So that's the crux of it. Not asking for more, as we will see, changes Oliver's destiny completely. Do I have any questions, comments, thoughts?
No open questions.
Okay. So we find out that, the workhouse decides that they can't have somebody as dangerous, as rebellious as poor Oliver Twist living in the workhouse, because, heaven knows what will happen when a boy's asked for more gruel, that, walls will come tumbling down and people will demand actually being fed, so they've got to get rid of him. So they decide that they're going to basically apprentice him out, pay somebody to take him to be an apprentice. If you read Great Expectations with me, you will know that Pip was apprenticed to Joe by Miss Havisham, who paid Joe to take Pip as his apprentice. And the deal with an apprentice is that you didn't earn any money while you were there, but you learned a trade, and you were fed and housed and clothed by your apprentice master. Joe says in that book that, even if Pip had had nobody to pay his articles of apprenticeship, that Joe would have taught Pip for nothing because he was family. But paying for articles of apprenticeship was a way to sort of guarantee that somebody gets to learn a trade and, as I say, gets fed and housed and clothed for that. It's usually 7 years of time, and then after 7 years, the apprentice is free to go out and try and find work on their own. So we have Mr. Gamfield comes into the picture. He's a chimney sweep, and we all know of the horrors of the trade of the chimney sweep in Victorian times. They liked very little children, boys and girls, because they could actually fit inside the whole chimney of these bigger houses and go up and clean them. And, God knows how many died in horrible, terrible conditions. They got stuck and smothered and suffocated in these chimneys. But there was no legislation to prevent this happening. So we can tell how Mr. Gamfield is going to be basically by the way he treats his donkey, which is, a particularly cruel way too. But Mr. Gamfield comes up and he sees that they've got basically a boy to give out for an apprenticeship. And, that we see the worst of the sort of the chimney sweeps trade. Dickens was well aware of, the deaths of children in chimneys and things like that. And he has Mr. Gamfield give a defense of this barbaric practice by, Mr. Gamfield comes before the board, and the board says to him, "It's a nasty trade, sweeping chimneys. young boys have been smothered in chimneys before now. And Mr. Gamfield's defense of this is, that's because they damped the straw before they lit it in the chimney to make him come down again, said Gamfield. That's all smoke and no blaze. Whereas smoke ain't no use at all in making a boy come down, for it only sends him to sleep, and that's what he likes. Basically, if you put damp straw to create a lot of smoke, Gamfield is saying it makes the boys go to sleep, and that's what they like. They're stuck up a chimney. Boys is very obstinate and very lazy gentleman. There's nothing like a good hot blaze to make him come down with a run. So his defense is to say, well, actually, you should just light a big fire and then they'll come down in a hurry. It's humane too, gentlemen, because even if they stuck in the chimney, roasting their feet makes them struggle to extricate themselves. It's horrific. So, but you know, Gamfield is clearly somebody who doesn't have any sort of shreds of humanity about this profession. So the board are then discussing and they say, well, you know, we don't approve of this because they're trying to balance up in their own minds whether the saving of expenditure and looking well in the accounts, i.e. they won't have to pay for Oliver anymore, is really balanced out by you know, the scandal that will ensue even for a brief time when Oliver gets smothered or burned alive in a chimney. And they say, well, you know, they say to Mr. Gamfield, we're not going to approve it. We can't give you Oliver on these terms. As Mr. Gamfield did happen to labor under the slight imputation of having bruised 3 or 4 boys to death already, it occurred to him that the board had perhaps in some unaccountable freak taken it into their heads that this extraneous circumstance ought to influence their proceedings. So, you know, he's about to walk out and he says, so you're not going to give me the boy for an apprentice? And then Mr. Limkins says, at least as it's a very nasty business, we think you ought to take something less than the premium we offered. In other words, we think you're a terrible human being. We think you're probably going to get this boy killed in the most barbaric of circumstances. And so if we're going to do it, we just don't want to pay that much for it. And so they go into this kind of, you know, bargaining position about how much will you take. He said, you know, they're just doing this kind of take him for nothing kind of thing. And eventually they get down to a price that they can agree on, and everything looks set fair for poor Oliver to go and enter this horrible profession and be consigned to the chimney sweep's care. I see we have Kathy says, do we know whether Dickens' novels had an impact on changing the poor laws? It occurs to me that in the 20th century, England was generous to its people after World War II, giving everyone the national healthcare system. Yeah, they did have some impact, and people read them and became aware of what was going on. And it did open a lot of people's eyes. And throughout the 19th century, there were several further amendments, both to the voting acts and to the poor laws. This poor law was the first. They were followed by many other poor laws that amended the provisions and tried to rectify the very worst of this poor law. So this was just the first. And at the publication of this book, it's only 2 or 3 years old. The impacts are just being coming to the forefront. So I can't remember when the next poor law was, but it was not that long after. Sometime in the 1840s, I believe, and they did try and remedy some of the worst effects of this poor law. And there were several other poor laws throughout the 19th century. It went hand in hand, as I say, along with reforming the voting system. It wasn't until the 20th century that women got the vote, but the vote was opened up to more and more men throughout the 19th century. and it came along with child labor laws and laws regarding education. So although by the beginning of the 20th century, Victoria died in 1901, so really in the 20th century, the beginning of it, we would still not recognize this sort of system of either voting or, you know, the requirements for education or the laws allowing child labor, although they would still be horrible to us in today's world. They had come a long way from 1834. It did change over the century, but it took a long time. So we get to Oliver's fate. He gets to be in front of the magistrates, and you know, he's fascinated by the powdered wigs that they wear. You can picture those, you know, those white powdered wigs that the magistrates had, and Oliver's fate comes down to a tiny chance, really. The critical moment of Oliver's fate, the old gentleman goes to dip his pen in the inkstand to put enough ink in to sign the indentures, the articles, if you like, of apprenticeship. If the inkstand had been where the old gentleman thought it was, he would have dipped his pen into it and signed the indentures, and Oliver would have been straightway hurried off. But as it chanced to be immediately under his nose, it followed as a matter of course that he looked all over his desk for it without finding it. And happening in the course of his search to look straight before him, his gaze encountered the pale and terrified face of Oliver Twist, who, despite all the admonitory looks and pinches of Bumble, was regarding the repulsive countenance of his future master with a mingled expression of horror and fear, too palpable to mistaken, even by a half-blind magistrate. So he said, he says to Oliver, you know, are you afraid? What's the matter? And Oliver tells him, I don't want to do this, basically. And Mr. Bumble, the beadle, tries to intervene, and the magistrate tells him, shut up, basically. And he's appalled. How could you speak like this? I'm a beadle, but, you know. And they make him take him back to the workhouse. So he dodges that bullet. And, you know, he finds himself, Oliver Twist, at the very end of that chapter 3. The next morning, the public were once more informed that Oliver Twist was again to let, and that £5 would be paid to anybody who would take possession of him. So the phrase to let, you still see, of course, on rental properties. So Oliver is not being treated as a human being. He's just being treated as a piece of property to be got rid of. And we find that he's given into the care of Mr. Sowerberry. Mr. Sowerberry is sour, and his wife is even more sour. And he's the parochial undertaker. So obviously, you know, he has people who pay him for coffins if they die and they have means, but he's required and paid for by the parish to provide a coffin for everybody, no matter how poor they are. And, you know, it's the cheapest possible coffin of, you know, not these fabulous ornate coffins that they started to have later in the Victorian era, but these coffins for the poor are just plain boards, you know, the cheapest possible thing. So poor Oliver is consigned to the Sowerberries, and they are sour by name, sour by nature. And you know, we know he's not going to have a great time there. At the end, towards the end of chapter 4, Mr. Sowerberry says to his wife, "My dear, this is the boy from the workhouse that I told you of." Oliver bowed again. "Dear me," said the undertaker's wife, "he's very small." It was interesting because Mr. Gamfield, the chimney sweep, thought that Oliver's smallness was a virtue because he'd fit up the chimneys, but the undertakers are wary of him being so small because they don't know how much work they'll be able to get out of him. Well, he is rather small, replied Mr. Bumble, looking at Oliver as if it were his fault that he were no bigger, i.e. Oliver's fault. He is small, there's no denying it, but he'll grow, Mrs. Sowerberry, he'll grow. I dare say he will, replied the lady pettishly, and our victuals and our drink. Basically, he's going to grow because he's going to keep eating our food and drinking our drink. And she instructs Charlotte, the girl who looks after the house, give this boy some of the cold bits that were put by for Trip. Trip's the dog. Oliver's getting the bits of food that they put aside, and even the dog has turned his nose up at. And then we end this chapter with poor Oliver being taken back upstairs to the shop and said, you know, your bed's under the counter, and he's sleeping amongst the coffins. This poor 9-year-old boy has got, you know, ending his day with food that was too bad for the dog, and is sleeping under a counter with all these coffins. And obviously there's no dead people in them, but it's not a particularly cheerful way to live. And a reminder, I think, again, just how close, you know, death is for everybody in that Oliver's situation, with the lack of food and the lack of hygiene and all the other wants that they have. So I think to read to the end of chapter 5 before we just go through that. Any questions? Any comments?
None, thank you.
Okay. So we find the next morning we're introduced to Noah Claypole, and he is Oliver's immediate boss in this situation, although Noah Claypole is really only a boy himself. A big charity boy, he's called. A charity boy is it means a boy who attends a school that's paid for by charity. He's eating a slice of bread and butter, which must seem, you know, a huge luxury to Oliver. And anyway, he finds out that this charity boy, who's not probably that much older, only probably 4 or 5 years older than Oliver, is now his boss. And Noah Claypole isn't going to be any kinder to Oliver than anybody else has ever been. And then he says, we hear that Mr. Sowerberry decides to take Oliver to a funeral as a mute. A mute was a sort of a paid-for mourner who doesn't say anything, hence mute, but is there to sort of contribute to the general sorrow of the proceedings by standing there in, you know, dark funereal clothing, and if they can cry to order, that's even better. And Oliver's propensity for being able to cry seems to suggest to Mr. Sowerberry that he'd make a good mourner. He says to Mrs. Sowerberry, there's an expression of melancholy in his face, my dear, which is very interesting. He would make a delightful mute. You know, the boy is miserable because he's in a place where there's nobody to love him. There's no warmth. There's barely enough food. There's, you know, nothing good about this place. So the expression of melancholy in his face, Mr. Sowerberry decides is interesting. Again, complete and total lack of humanity with these people. So anyway, they decide to dress Oliver up and take him to this funeral. And again, you know, this chapter is really just, it's not terribly material to the story, but we just get an opportunity to see things through the eyes maybe of these people who are so desperately poor that we can't even really comprehend how they could even live. when they step into the room where the dead body is, this is what Oliver sees. There was no fire in the room, but a man was crouching mechanically over the empty stove. An old woman, too, had drawn a low stool into the cold hearth and was sitting behind him. There were some ragged children in another corner, and in a small recess opposite the door, there lay upon the ground something covered with an old blanket. Oliver shuddered as he cast his eyes towards the place and crept involuntarily closer to his master, for though it was covered up, the boy felt that it was a corpse. The man's face was very thin and pale, his hair and beard were grisly, and his eyes were bloodshot. The old woman's face was wrinkled, her two remaining teeth protruded over her underlip, and her eyes were bright and piercing. Oliver was afraid to look at either her or the man. They seemed so like the rats he'd seen outside. Nobody shall go near her, said the man, starting fiercely up as the undertaker approached the recess. Keep back if you've a life to lose. And the undertaker's all business and saying, nonsense, we've got to, give her a funeral, we've got to bury her. The man is, we see is the only one who's got any grief for her. The old woman still, doesn't seem to have any feeling about it. But she says, she was my daughter, said the old woman, nodding her head in the direction of the corpse and speaking with an idiotic leer more ghastly than even the presence of death in such a place. Lord, Lord, well, it is strange that I, who gave birth to her and was a woman then, should be alive and merry now, and she's laying there so cold and stiff. Lord, Lord, to think of it, it's as good as a play, as good as a play. I mean, how horrific is that? Now, whether she's kind of, drunk or insensible or half insane, we don't know, but this lack of maternal warmth is really quite horrific, and it's only the man, who shows any remorse. But we see here Oliver now confronting really essentially what must have been very similar to his own mother's demise. Of course, when he was born, he can't possibly have any memory of that, but his mother must have suffered and died in very similar circumstances and lived in very similar circumstances, quite possibly. And so this is a chapter, as I say, that doesn't really advance the story very much, but gives Oliver and us some kind of insight into the sort of circumstances of his own birth and upbringing. The ragged children in the corner, we assume, are the children of the woman who's died, and they're left with this pair of old woman and an old man who are really just horrific stand-ins for parents, in much the same way that Oliver's stand-in for his parents in the workhouse, Mrs. Mann, and then the people in the workhouse, Mrs. Mann and Mr. Limbkins. So, we're left with Oliver at the end of that, being with Mr. Sowerberry, and Mr. Sowerberry saying to him, well, how'd you like it so far? And Oliver's saying, not much, really, no. Which is, quite shocking. So we get a good glimpse at this point, I think, of the kind of, life that the poor people had. Donna says, the attitude toward children at this time is morally reprehensible. Did the attitude towards the children have to do with class? Did Dickens mean to change that attitude with his characterization of Oliver? Good question. It was not so much that the attitude towards children, I think, was morally reprehensible, in that it was more an attitude towards the poor that was morally reprehensible. The attitude, the Victorian attitude basically was, if you were born poor, there was a reason for it. It was because your parents were lazy, good for nothings, and because you were their child, you were born lazy and good for nothing. And there was really, people were indifferent as to whether you lived or died, because you were just going to be a burden on people no matter what. There was no sort of sense of, children are born and can be changed by their environment and to become good, productive citizens if they're treated humanely and given an education and fed well. So yes, it was different for the children of the middle and upper classes because their parents weren't lazy good-for-nothings. Their parents obviously had money, and they did that because they had all the right moral characteristics. It is kind of interesting, and there's a lot of criticism on this about, how Dickens plainly did see that these children were being horrendously ill-treated, as were the adults in the workhouse for that matter. But there's still some sort of lingering, the other poor people that he encounters are not depicted terribly well either. So I think Dickens is kind of having a bit of an internal battle about how much poor people brought it on themselves, if you will. And that's a fascinating thought. I mean, he was a product of his own upbringing and his own time, and I think he could recognize that children shouldn't be assumed to be lazy good-for-nothings, but there's somewhere lingering in some of these depictions a little bit of, well, the adults who are more responsible should be doing a little bit better too. So but the attitude towards the children was very much, you're born that way because your parents were that way. They were poor, you're going to be poor, you're going to be a burden. Nothing we can do that will change that. You are as you are. So any more comments, questions?
None, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. So next week we are reading to the end of chapter 15. Oh, one question popped up. Beth says, how much of a childhood did middle and upper class children have? Were they assumed to be little adults in need of training? I think very much so, yes, certainly at this point, Beth. I think it began to change towards the end of this century, but certainly in the beginnings of the Victorian era, yes, they were mini adults and just had to be trained that way. And so, boys were taught to read and taught to read the classics and all those things so that they could have a part in an adult life and manage their own affairs. And girls were taught to sew and to embroider and do all those things because, that's what they were going to be useful for. I did a course when I did my master's on children's literature, and it's kind of fascinating to see that at this point in the 19th century, in the early half of the century, children's literature is entirely didactic. There's no sense that it should be. It's very much about teaching children morals and Christian virtues and nothing else. And it's only later on towards the end of the century that children's literature becomes more about seeing children as people who deserve interesting other stories about children. So. Donna says, would you consider Dickens a naturalist writer who believed that one is a product of their environment and or class and can't change your destiny as a result? I think there is, I think he's struggling with that. I think because he had such a poor upbringing and he became very, very rich. I think on one level, he recognizes that people can change. But on another level, I think he sees that the environment and the way that the poor are treated means that they are unable to escape that. So I think there's a struggle going on in there in his own mind. And Grace says, what edition of the book are you using? The book I have is the Norton Critical Edition. I like that because it has essays in the back about critical essays information about the poor law, reviews, and things like that. So that's where I get some of my secondary information about the book. Can I give a class on the Victorian era and times? Yes, maybe that would be fun to talk about everything from, what the cities looked like, smelt like, felt like, to what kind of education people had. And Ginge says, aren't we still hearing echoes of this in politicians who think unemployment insurance just makes people not want to get a job? Yes, I mean, these attitudes persist that, if you're poor and indigent, it's your own fault. So yeah, completely agree. I mean, it's, we've come a long way, but yeah. John, what is the name of the website where you get free editions to download? It's Project Gutenberg. I think it's just projectgutenberg.com. Mary Lou, I want a class on Victorian times. I want more. So, all right, well, that's a good thought. Maybe that's something we can do in spring and bring in some little excerpts from books that will give you ideas of what else to read as we go along. Anthony says, don't you find it ironic that they can make a musical out of a very depressing situation? Absolutely. And I will tell you, if you have seen the musical, that it is not necessarily that true to the book if you haven't finished the book yet. The central characters are consistent, but there's a lot of changes. Hi, Christine.
Christine,
can you hear me? Oh, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Wasn't there a character in The Tale of Two Cities who was digging up graves? Was that to use the coffin again? I can't remember.
No, they may well have done that. I'm sure that was part of it, but they were digging up graves so they could sell the bodies to the universities for medical research.
Oh, okay. I couldn't remember.
But I'm sure they took the coffin and either sold that or made good use of it too, if they hadn't rotted away. I mean, they were very cheap. Anything that had been in the ground for very long would have rotted away. But in the Tale of Two Cities, we saw them dig up a corpse the very day it got buried. So I'm sure they didn't leave the coffin behind.
Horrible. Well, thank you.
Oh, Susan says Gutenberg.org, not com. So John, if you struggle to find it, email me and I will send you the link. Steph says, I'd love a class on children's literature, either contemporary or history of the development of the genre. It was absolutely fascinating. I thought, I like a lot of the classes I took because I heard that the professor was a good professor, and this was Professor Michaels at GMU. And I kind of thought, well, whatever she's going to offer, I'll take, because I'd heard such great things about her classes. And it was absolutely fascinating. I didn't know quite how much I'd enjoy it, but just seeing the development of children's literature from these early, heavily moral, really barely children's books come to sort of full fruition with the sort of the golden age of stories like Secret Garden and The Little Princess and stories like that was wonderful. So lots of good ideas. Jeff says, in a previous course, you recommended Eliza Pickard's book about life during Victorian times, and you thought the book was excellent. Yes, it really is. It's very good indeed. And again, I can share that title with you if anybody needs it. No, I don't have it here. I will dig it out and share that title if anybody wants it, or I will mention it and show it to you next week. Lots of good background information, but I think, it is, I was reading a little bit, just everything that we sort of take for granted. And when you see the movie versions of these books, it's sort of sanitized and not real, but, the roads in London, for a long, long time were not paved. And then when they started paving the roads, the noise apparently of metal wheels and horses' hooves on the sort of the stones that they started to put down was incredible. And people, you know, were looking for a different solution. This is, of course, before, you know, proper paved roads as we know it. At one point, they paved some roads paved with wooden planks. And they found out that was great. It really deadened the noise and it was wonderful until it got wet. And then the horses' hooves started slipping out from under them and the horses died and the carts were upset and that was no good either. So a lot of things that we don't even think about, you know, just the idea that there was no rule about which side of the road you drove on in Victorian times for decades. And, you know, the people really resented the police trying to make people drive on one side of the road or the other. They just wanted to go right down the middle where it was safest. So all sorts of wonderful things to talk about. And thank you for your thanks. Kathy, the Liza Pickard book was Victorian London, and it's Liza with a Z or with a Z, Liza or Liza, depending on which country you're in. Pickard, Picard, Liza Pickard. So thank you very much. I hope you're going to love this book and enjoy it, and it'll be fun going through it. And now go off and sing Who Will Buy This Wonderful Morning, or Food, Glorious Food, and enjoy the movie.